I just want to check my balance. The sentence was small, so ordinary that it should have disappeared the moment it was spoken. But it didn't. It lingered. It moved slowly through the vast marble lobby of First National Bank, brushing against polished pillars, gliding over glass walls, and settling deep into the room like a whisper that refused to be ignored. For a fraction of a second, the building itself seemed to pause. The echo of footsteps faded. Keyboards stopped clicking. The soft instrumental music piping through hidden speakers suddenly felt too loud. A man in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit froze mid-sip, espresso hovering inches from his lips. A woman leaning against a column, scrolling endlessly on her phone, lifted her head without realizing why. Two junior bankers near the reception desk exchanged smirks, their expressions shaped by habit more than cruelty. At the center of the lobby stood Margaret Bennett, 90 years old. She leaned gently on a wooden cane, its handle smoothed by decades of touch. The cane wasn't decorative. It wasn't symbolic. It was practical, the kind of thing you carry when you've walked far more miles than anyone around you ever will. Her coat was brown once, long ago. Now it was the color of time, faded, softened, worn thin at the elbows. Her shoes were clean but old, their soles reshaped by years of quiet responsibility. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from age. She stood straight anyway. Margaret didn't scan the room nervously. She didn't search for help. She didn't apologize for taking up space. She simply waited. To most people in the lobby, she was background noise, another elderly woman who had wandered somewhere she didn't belong. Someone harmless, someone forgettable. Invisibility had followed Margaret for most of her life. But invisibility has weight. And now, that weight pressed down on the room in a way no one could quite explain. Behind the reception desk, polished brass letters gleamed under chandelier light. First National Bank, EST 1921. Margaret looked at the sign, her eyes lingering just a moment longer than necessary. She wasn't reading words. She was remembering history. This building had existed before she was born. It had grown wealthy while people like her cleaned its floors, polished its marble, and were told never to sit in its chairs. She adjusted her grip on the cane and took a slow breath. "I just want to check my balance," she repeated. Softer this time. Steadier. The air changed. Not dramatically, not obviously, but something subtle shifted, the kind of tension you feel before a storm breaks. Somewhere above the lobby, on the 10th floor, a man who believed he understood power was about to decide that this moment did not deserve respect. And that decision would cost him everything. Charles Hayes had learned very early in life that confidence, when worn correctly, could pass for authority. At 52, he carried himself like a man who believed the world had already agreed with him. His hair was neatly combed back, touched with gray at the temples in a way that suggested wisdom rather than age. His suit, custom-tailored, Italian fabric, fit him the way power fits people who never question whether they deserve it. President of First National Bank. Third generation Hayes. That title wasn't just a job to Charles. It was inheritance. It was proof. Proof that his bloodline mattered. From the glass balcony on the upper level of the lobby, Charles had been watching the morning crowd with mild satisfaction. Numbers were good this quarter. Investors were calm. The bank's reputation, polished, elite, selective, remained intact. Then he heard it. "I just want to check my balance." At first, he assumed it was a joke. Some kind of misunderstanding between a teller and a confused customer. Then he saw her. Small, old, brown coat, wooden cane. Something inside him tightened. Not fear, not anger, but irritation. These moments bothered him more than crises ever did. Crises were important. This was inconvenient. He descended the marble staircase slowly, deliberately, making sure people noticed clearly who was in charge. Conversations quieted as he passed. Heads turned. Respect followed him like a trained animal. By the time he reached the lobby floor, Margaret Bennett was still standing there. Still waiting. Still taking up space. Charles smiled. The practiced, effortless smile of a man who had never been told no in any way that mattered. Then he laughed. Not softly, not kindly. He laughed loudly. The kind of laugh meant to teach a lesson. "Ma'am," he said, projecting his voice so it traveled across the lobby. "I think there's been a misunderstanding." A few nearby customers glanced at one another, amused. They knew this tone. They'd heard it used on people who didn't belong, people who disrupted the aesthetic. This, Charles continued, gesturing subtly to the polished marble floors, the gleaming chandeliers, the quiet wealth in tailored suits and leather briefcases, is a private institution. He paused. Let it sink in. Perhaps, he added with a thin smile, you're looking for the community bank down the street. There it was. The unspoken translation everyone understood. You are in the wrong place. A ripple of laughter moved through the room. Nervous, shallow, eager to align with power. Margaret did not laugh. She did not flinch. She did not explain herself. She simply looked at Charles. And for a moment, just a moment, something unsettled him. Her eyes weren't confused. They weren't pleading. They were calm. Calmer than his. Charles cleared his throat, annoyed at himself for noticing. Janet, he said sharply, turning toward his assistant behind the desk. Why is this situation unresolved? Janet, a woman in her early 30s with alert eyes and a posture trained to disappear, hesitated. She asked to check her account. Sir, Janet replied carefully. We haven't. Charles waved a dismissive hand. We don't need to waste time, he said. This happens more often than you'd think. Margaret reached into her coat pocket. Slowly, deliberately, she pulled out a small black card. It wasn't shiny. It wasn't new. Its edges were worn, softened by decades of use. She held it between her fingers and extended it forward. I didn't ask for directions, Margaret said calmly. I asked to check my balance. Charles barely glanced at the card. He scoffed. Another fake, he said loudly, as if narrating a performance. Some people just love attention. A few customers laughed again, louder this time, relieved that the situation had been defined for them. Janet leaned closer, lowering her voice. Sir, we could just verify. No, Charles snapped. We don't reward nonsense. Margaret smiled. It wasn't the smile of embarrassment. It wasn't the smile of someone caught in a lie. It was something far more dangerous. It was the smile of someone who had already lived through worse than this man could imagine. Charles noticed it and didn't like it. Security, he said loudly, straightening his cuffs. Let's help this woman find the exit. 2 security guards approached. They were big men, trained, professional, but neither of them looked eager. Ma'am, one said gently, we've been asked to escort you outside. Margaret tightened her grip on the cane. I didn't say I was leaving, she replied softly. I said I want to check my balance. Charles laughed again. This is exactly why we have security, he announced. Confused people trying to access services they don't understand. Someone near the coffee station whispered. Poor thing, probably senile. Margaret heard it. She laughed. Not nervously, not weakly. She laughed deeply, a sound rich with memory, survival, and something else entirely. The laughter echoed, and suddenly, the room felt different. Charles shifted his weight. He didn't know why, but the confidence he'd worn so easily moments ago felt tighter now, less comfortable. Margaret lifted her eyes to him. Senile, she repeated thoughtfully. She tilted her head slightly. That's interesting, she said quietly. Because I remember cleaning your grandfather's office in 1955. The lobby fell silent. Not awkward silence. Not polite silence. The kind of silence that hits like a door slamming shut. Charles froze. What did you say? He demanded. Margaret didn't raise her voice. I was 15, she continued evenly. I worked 14 hours a day. Your grandfather liked to leave cigarettes burning on the marble floor. She looked down at the gleaming tiles beneath her feet. I never complained, she added. We needed the money. Charles felt something cold slide into his chest. These are stories, he muttered. Anyone can make up stories. Margaret lifted her gaze again. Your grandfather had a scar on his left hand, she said softly. He got it the day he tried to hit me and missed. The last trace of laughter disappeared. People began stepping back, creating distance. Charles swallowed. For the first time in his life, power did not answer him immediately, and that terrified him. For a moment, Charles Hayes forgot how to breathe, not because he believed her, but because the room had stopped obeying him. Power, to Charles, had always behaved like a loyal servant. When he raised his voice, people moved. When he laughed, others followed. When he dismissed someone, they disappeared. But now, no one was laughing. No one was moving. No one was looking at him. They were looking at her. Margaret Bennett stood quietly in the center of the lobby, her cane planted firmly against the marble floor like a stake driven into history itself. She had said nothing extraordinary. No accusation. No threat. No demand. Just a memory. And yet that memory had landed like a hammer. Charles straightened his back, forcing his posture into place. He had handled crises before: regulatory audits, hostile investors, press scandals that could have sunk weaker men. This was not a crisis. This was an interruption. "Enough," he said sharply, his voice cutting through the silence like glass. He stepped forward, close enough now to look down at her. "You expect us to believe that story?" he scoffed. "You expect us to believe you cleaned offices in this building 70 years ago?" Margaret did not step back. "I don't expect anything from you," she replied calmly. That answer irritated him more than anger ever could. She wasn't pleading. She wasn't defensive. She wasn't trying to convince him. She was simply stating facts. Charles turned to the crowd, forcing a laugh. "This is exactly what I mean," he said loudly. "People romanticize the past. They invent connections to places they've never belonged." Belonged. The word hung heavy in the air. Margaret reached into her coat again. Slowly, deliberately. Her movements were careful, not shaky, not rushed, as if each second was intentional. From the inside pocket, she pulled out the card again. Small, black, worn thin at the edges. She held it up, letting the light catch it. "I've had this longer than you've had authority," she said quietly. Charles rolled his eyes. "Janet," he snapped, without looking away from Margaret. "Another fake card. I'm not interested in theatrics." Janet hesitated, this time longer. Her eyes lingered on the card, not because it looked impressive, but because it looked old. Not cheaply made, not flashy, enduring. "Sir," Janet said carefully, lowering her voice, "we could just run it through the system. It would take seconds." Charles turned on her. "No," he said sharply. "We do not reward attention-seeking behavior." A murmur passed through the room. Not agreement. Uncertainty. Margaret extended the card toward Janet instead. Janet's instinct betrayed her. She reached out slightly before stopping herself. Charles noticed, and that frightened him. "Don't touch it," he barked. "You don't know where it's been." Margaret's lips curved into a faint smile. "Neither did you," she said, "when your grandfather handed me his trash to throw away. That did it." Charles felt something inside him snap. Not anger, but humiliation. He had been insulted in public, in his building, by a woman who, in his mind, should have known her place. "Security," he said again, louder now. "This has gone far enough." The two guards stepped closer. One of them, the younger one, glanced at the card again. "Ma'am," he said gently, "maybe we can sort this out outside." Margaret shook her head. "I've spent my life being escorted out of places," she replied softly. "I'm not leaving until I finish my business." Charles laughed sharply. "This is not a grocery store," he said. "You don't just wander in and demand services." Margaret looked at him, truly looked at him now. "Do you know what I did with my first paycheck?" she asked. Charles blinked, thrown off. "I bought my mother's shoes," Margaret continued, "because her feet bled from cleaning floors like this." She tapped her cane lightly against the marble. "This building paid for its shine with people it never remembered." The lobby was silent again. Charles felt the shift, the kind he could not control. "Enough," he snapped. "Remove her. Now." One of the guards reached gently for Margaret's arm. She didn't pull away. She didn't resist. She looked at Charles one last time. "Before you do," she said softly, "you might want to look at the card." Charles waved dismissively. "I don't need to." "Look," she repeated. Something in her tone stopped him. Not fear. Not command. Certainty. Against his better judgment, Charles snatched the card from her hand. He glanced at it and scoffed. "No chip," he said. "No modern security. This is obsolete." Margaret nodded. "It was issued before your father learned to count interest," she replied. Janet leaned closer now, unable to help herself. "Sir," she whispered. "The serial format." Charles ignored her. "Call the police," he barked. "This woman is disturbing customers." Margaret laughed again, softly, almost kindly. "I'd like that," she said. "They still recognize my name." Charles stiffened. "What name?" he demanded. Margaret met his eyes. "Bennett," she said. "Margaret Bennett." And somewhere deep inside the building's systems, databases that hadn't been accessed in decades, something ancient stirred. The moment Charles Hayes said the word police, the temperature of the lobby changed. Not physically. The air conditioning still hummed softly from hidden vents, but emotionally, something tightened. Conversations that had begun to restart died instantly. People shifted their weight, instinctively creating space, the way crowds do when they sense something ugly approaching. Security stood closer now. Two men, dark uniforms, earpieces, hands folded in front of them, trained to appear calm even when the situation was not. Margaret Bennett felt their presence before they touched her. She had felt it many times before in her life. That quiet pressure, that unspoken instruction to move, to obey, to disappear. She did none of those things. "Ma'am," the older guard said gently, lowering his voice so only she could hear. "We really don't want this to escalate." Margaret looked up at him. "You already decided it would," she replied softly. The guard hesitated. He wasn't used to answers like that. Behind them, Charles Hayes crossed his arms, satisfaction slowly returning to his posture. This, uniforms, authority, removal, was familiar territory. This was where things corrected themselves. "This is a private institution," Charles announced again, louder now, as if repetition made it truer. "We reserve the right to refuse service." Margaret nodded once. "So did the schools," she said. "So did the libraries. So did the hospitals." Her voice never rose. That somehow made it worse. Charles waved a dismissive hand. "Escort her out," he ordered. Gently, if possible. The younger guard reached for Margaret's elbow. She didn't resist. She didn't flinch. But as his fingers brushed her sleeve, she straightened, slowly, deliberately, until she was standing as tall as her 90-year-old body would allow. "I want it noted," she said calmly, her voice carrying farther than anyone expected, "that I was never offered service." Several people in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Phones began to appear, discreetly at first, then openly. Screens lifted. Red recording lights blinked to life. Charles noticed. His jaw tightened. "Put those away," he snapped at no one in particular. "This is not a spectacle." But it already was. Margaret took a slow step forward with her cane, then stopped. "I have waited longer than this building has existed," she said. "I can wait a few more minutes." Charles laughed sharply, though it sounded thinner now. "You think time makes you special?" he scoffed. "This bank runs on systems. On rules." Margaret smiled faintly. "Yes," she said. "I helped build some of them. That did it." Charles's patience snapped. "Enough," he shouted. "Remove her. Now." The guards moved again. This time, Margaret raised her hand. Not defensively, authoritatively. "Before you do," she said softly, "ask yourself one thing." The guards paused despite themselves. "What happens if I'm telling the truth?" Silence. The question lingered. "What happens," she continued, "if this card works?" Charles felt a flicker of doubt, quick, unwanted, and crushed it immediately. "It doesn't matter," he said coldly. "She doesn't belong here." The words slipped out before he could stop them. "Belong." The room heard it. Margaret did too. She turned toward him slowly. "Belonging," she said, "is not something you inherit." She glanced around the lobby, the marble, the glass, the wealth. "It's something you earn," she finished. A voice suddenly cut through the tension. Charles. Not loud, not angry, but firm. The kind of voice that didn't need volume. Everyone turned toward the entrance. The massive glass doors had opened quietly, and a man had walked in. The sound of the doors closing behind the man echoed softly through the marble lobby. Not a slam, not a bang. A final sound. The kind that told everyone, without explanation, that something had shifted. Charles Hayes felt it first. The confidence that had wrapped around him like a tailored jacket suddenly felt heavy, too tight. He didn't recognize the man at first, just the presence. Tall, composed, expensive without trying to be. The guards froze. Not because they were ordered to, but because instinct told them to. Margaret Bennett turned slowly, her cane tapping once against the floor. She didn't smile. She didn't frown. Recognition passed through her eyes like a quiet sunrise. The man stopped a few steps inside the lobby, removed his gloves, looked around, and then his gaze landed on her. His posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough for people who understood power to notice. "Mrs. Bennett," he said warmly, "I was hoping I'd catch you before lunch." A breath went out of the room all at once. Charles blinked. Once. Twice. "Gerald?" he said uncertainly. Gerald Simmons turned his head just enough to acknowledge him. Charles. No title. No warmth. Margaret inclined her head slightly. "You're late," she said. Gerald smiled. "You always said punctuality was respect," he replied. "I'm still working on it." The lobby had gone completely silent. No phones. No whispers. Even the espresso machine behind the counter seemed to stop hissing. Charles laughed nervously. "This is a misunderstanding," he said quickly. "This woman is causing a disruption." Gerald's eyes returned to Margaret. "Are you?" he asked gently. Margaret shook her head. "I asked for my balance." Gerald exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled. "Did anyone provide it?" he asked. No one answered. Gerald turned fully toward Charles now. "You were aware she was here?" "Yes, but—" "And you chose not to verify her account." Charles opened his mouth. Nothing came out. Gerald nodded once, as if that confirmed something he already suspected. He turned back to Margaret. "Would you mind telling them," he said calmly, "how long you've banked with us?" Margaret rested both hands on her cane. "Since before this building had elevators," she replied. "Since checks were written by hand. Since your founder still needed investors." A murmur rippled through the room. Gerald's jaw tightened. Charles stepped forward. "This is absurd," he snapped. "Anyone can say anything." Margaret turned toward him, and for the first time, truly looked at him. Not as a nuisance, not as a child, but as a man standing on borrowed ground. "I didn't say I owned this bank," she said quietly. "I said I helped keep it alive." Charles scoffed. "You expect us to believe you were involved in institutional finance in the 1950s? He said mockingly. Margaret smiled. "No," she replied. "I expect you to remember who cleaned the offices while men like your grandfather made decisions." The room tightened. Margaret's voice grew steadier, clearer. "I was 15, she continued. "I scrubbed floors before school. I emptied ashtrays after hours. I learned names without ever being spoken to." She looked down at the marble beneath her feet. "Your grandfather liked Cuban cigars. He crushed them into this same floor." Charles swallowed. "Those are stories," he said weakly. "You can't prove." "He had a scar," Margaret said calmly. "Left hand. Knife accident." He blamed the maid. Gerald's head snapped toward Charles. Charles went pale. That's not public knowledge," he whispered. Margaret lifted her gaze. "He raised his hand once," she said softly. "Missed. Hit the desk instead." The silence became unbearable. People shifted. Someone covered their mouth. A woman near the door wiped her eyes without realizing she was crying. Charles's voice shook. "You're lying." Margaret didn't respond immediately. Instead, she reached into her coat. Not for the card. For something else. A folded photograph. Worn. Creased. Faded. She held it out. Gerald stepped forward, took it, and looked. His breath caught. He turned the photo toward Charles. A black and white image. A teenage girl holding a mop. Standing beside a desk. Charles recognized it instantly. He had seen it once in a dusty family album. His grandfather's office. The same desk. The same girl. The room broke into whispers. Charles stumbled backward. "That's not possible," he muttered. "That was decades ago." Margaret met his eyes. "Yes," she said, "and I'm still here." Charles Hayes had spent his entire life believing power was permanent, that once you climbed high enough, the ground below could never reach you. But as he stared at the photograph in Gerald Simmons' hand, something inside him cracked. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. The kind of crack that doesn't heal. The kind that spreads. The lobby no longer felt like his territory. It felt like a witness. He tried to laugh again, but the sound came out wrong. Thin, hollow, desperate. "This proves nothing," Charles said, his voice rising. "Old photographs don't rewrite reality." Margaret Bennett didn't argue. She didn't need to. Gerald stepped closer to Charles, lowering his voice, but somehow making it more dangerous. "Reality," Gerald said calmly, "is exactly what you're about to face." Charles turned to the room. "These people don't understand what's happening," he said sharply. "This is a private matter." But the crowd did understand. They understood that the man who had mocked an old woman moments earlier was now unraveling in front of her. The security guards shifted their weight. Not toward Margaret. Away from Charles. That terrified him. "Escort her out," Charles snapped one last time. "Now." No one moved. Gerald raised a single finger. "Everyone stays," he said. Not loudly, but definitively. Charles's mouth opened, then closed. He had never been disobeyed like this. Not here. Not ever. Margaret spoke again. "I didn't come to embarrass you," she said softly. "You did that yourself." She took a slow step forward. "You laughed because you thought I had nothing," she continued. "You panicked because you realized I had everything you didn't." Charles's hands began to shake. This wasn't anger anymore. This was fear. Real fear. the kind he had never learned how to manage. Gerald Simmons had watched powerful men fall before, usually in boardrooms, usually quietly, but never like this. He turned to the crowd. First National Bank exists because people trusted it, he said. And trust is fragile. He looked directly at Charles. You broke it today. Charles shook his head violently. You can't do this, he whispered. This is my bank. Gerald corrected him. No, he said. It was your family's bank. Margaret smiled faintly. And now, she added, it belongs to the future. Gerald gestured toward Janet. Proceed, he said. Janet nodded, nervous, respectful. Margaret took a seat, not because she was tired, because she belonged there. Gerald remained standing behind her, not as a guard, but as acknowledgement. Charles felt smaller by the second. For the first time in his life, he wasn't controlling the narrative. The system chimed softly as Janet accessed the account. Each second stretched. People leaned in. Phones quietly recorded. Janet's voice trembled slightly as she began reading. Not because of nerves, because of disbelief. The numbers weren't just large. They were intentional, built carefully over decades. Margaret watched the room instead of the screen. She watched faces change, watched arrogance dissolve, watched silence become respect. She had waited 90 years for this moment, and it tasted like peace. When the final number was spoken, no one clapped. No one gasped. They simply stood still. Nearly $19 million. But Margaret didn't smile. She didn't celebrate. She stood. I never wanted to be rich, she said. I wanted to be free. She turned to Charles. And today, she added, I am. Charles couldn't look at her anymore. The apology Charles attempted was weak, fragmented. Too late. Margaret accepted it anyway. Not for him. For herself. Power isn't loud, she said. It doesn't mock. It doesn't rush. She adjusted her coat. Power waits. And with that, she walked out. The lobby erupted, not in noise, but in realization. The headlines were brutal. Charles resigned, effective immediately. Policies changed. Training programs rewritten. Margaret Bennett was appointed to the board, not as a symbol, as a strategist. Scholarships were funded. Communities rebuilt. And the bank finally became what it claimed to be. Margaret never returned to check her balance again. She didn't need to. Her wealth was no longer measured in numbers. It was measured in futures changed, in silence earned, in respect restored. Because real power doesn't shout. It arrives quietly and stays forever.